guys, it's Becca. So this week's video is going to be pretty much all voiceover because a couple of people asked me last week to elaborate on some of the exercises that we had done and also asked me about critiques and what kind of feedback I was getting from the teachers. So I wanted to take some extra time today and just do a voiceover and really go over in detail pretty much all the exercises that we have been working on. So let's check it out. This is a warm-up exercise that we did for class. I love this kind of exercise because it's solely creative. You don't really have to have any technical understanding. So basically you pick a given silhouette and you try and put different kinds of portraits in there, different kinds of faces, and you try to make them as different as you can. It's a great exercise to just sort of get your creative juices flowing and start thinking creatively before you work on a bigger project. This may look pretty familiar. This is kind of a mix of a Riley abstraction, a Sorrow head construction. Essentially, we were just talking about the planes of the head, which is a very fundamental thing that I've been studying on and off now for a few years, but it keeps coming back because it is super important, and this type of exercise is always really helpful for me. This was another exercise focusing on the planes, but we were meant to draw in the planes on a given character that had already been created, a given animated or cartoon character. This is so hard. I actually totally bombed this exercise. I feel like I did not really understand it very well, but it's really interesting to start looking for those planes because in the past I would have never even thought to analyze them in that way, and now when I see different characters, I'm sort of better able to understand the planes, or at least it's something that I'm more aware of. We also talked a lot about facial expressions these last 2 weeks. So this is an exercise to try and figure out what actually happens when you make different facial expressions. So using photo reference, you draw in sort of what is being raised, what is being lowered, where the different stretch and shrink is happening on the face for a given expression. This is another creative exercise where we were exploring different nose types and how to create more stereotypically male noses versus more stereotypically female noses. This is another exercise for facial expressions, and like many things, I really struggle with facial expressions, and I realize this is probably because most of the portraiture study I've done has been on people with a very sort of normal, expressionless face, because when you do a longer drawing, usually it's somebody not smiling, somebody looking off into the distance like you would do with a regular model. So I have almost no experience drawing any characters with expressive faces. So this is very hard for me. I always have to use a photo reference. I can't just do this from memory at all or from imagination because I just don't have enough experience. And this is another facial exploration project for expressions. I got a really helpful critique on this one. One of my teachers, Elisabetta, she came around and did a draw over on my exercises, and this is for me the most helpful thing that you can get, for somebody to just literally draw over and show you exactly how you can exaggerate better, how you can show the facial expressions better, and what specifically you're doing wrong that you can improve on. So if you remember from last week, I have been working on this character design, and this was the air quotes final turnaround that I submitted, or the suggested idea that I had that I got critique on for my character project. And I wasn't really happy with it because I felt like my original characters had a much more appealing look. They were a little bit cuter and just had more simple shapes. And I found that when I did the final character, it got a bit kind of gross looking and much too complicated. The shapes were kind of messy and it just didn't have the appeal of the original sketches, and I couldn't quite figure out why. So my teacher gave me a really nice, Isabella is her name, she gave me a really nice draw over where she helped me simplify some of the shapes and gave the character, kind of brought back a lot more of the simplified facial characteristics that I had at the beginning, and you can see her full version of the character on the left, and I think it's so much better, and it still, kind of has the essence of the original character, but is much more aesthetically pleasing, and got after a lot of those things that I felt like I had lost and wasn't quite able to capture in the final drawing. She also made some corrections just on the stance and the general arc of the body and the way the spine angles and sort of how the arms connect and things like that. So again, this type of feedback is so helpful because you can see how to modify your work in the future to make it more interesting and more accurate. And so once I got my character figured out. Obviously, these things never feel done. They're always exercises, so you can always improve them and always go back and modify the character. But we had an exercise where we had to do character gestures, so we did 8 different drawings of our character, kind of engaging in its villainness. So this is my character doing various science experimental type things and being an explorer. I also got a really great, super amazing critique on this one, and you can see the draw over. A lot of my problems happen because my figures are very stiff, and this is something that it's a totally normal thing for people who are not super experienced at figure drawing. It's something that I've been working on by going to life drawing and that sort of thing. But you can see exactly kind of where I can add more dynamic features to the characters and how I can push the shapes and push the drama and make them feel a bit more dynamic. We also worked on facial expressions for our characters. So this was my first round attempt, and the biggest piece of feedback was that it wasn't consistent enough to feel like the same character. The head shape changed. A lot of the facial features just didn't feel consistent throughout. So I went back and tried to modify so it felt more like the original characters. So if you look at the top row, this was my second attempt. My feedback on this was that it is a little too symmetrical. So on the bottom row, you can see I tried to do a couple more expressions where I made the mouth less symmetrical on both sides, and that really helps to me. I think it's really obvious. You can see that the expressions feel much more lifelike. They feel much more lively and interesting and less static, which was, again, like I was saying before, a similar problem coming up with some of my gesture drawings, my character movement drawings, is that they felt a little stiff. So I think this bottom row of facial expressions looks quite a bit better, but obviously I still have a long way to go on these. And here was some color exploration for my character using some general rules or beliefs about what colors represent in standard traditional Western animated movies. So moving on from the character exercises, for this drawing, it was kind of a perspective challenge drawing where we had to draw something, and it had to be very clear that the perspective was from coming from something that was very small or from a very low level. So I decided to do sort of a crab's eye view of a sandcastle. And the main feedback on this was that the sandcastle looked too much like a regular castle, and it didn't have sort of like that loose sandy look. So if I were to redo this, I would make it a little bit less perfect looking. So it was very clear. It communicated more quickly that it was made of sand and not just an actual weird castle. My teacher also suggested that I could try and maybe put some crab claws in it. So if it were really a crab's eye view, a crab would probably see its own claws in front of it. So I thought that could be a really fun compositional element as well. This was a quick fun exercise that we did in class. We created a sketch for a book cover for Frankenstein using various kind of more realistic and less realistic perspective tricks. This is my first attempt at a plein air painting on my iPad, and actually possibly my first attempt at any plein air anything. This was an uphill battle, I have to say. I didn't really know how to do this. I didn't know how to start. I didn't know what brushes to use. It's not the best looking thing, but the best part was I am sitting there in the middle of metropolitan Rome, like a huge city, and all of a sudden out of nowhere, like 10 cows just walk by right through the middle of the scene, in the middle of the park. I couldn't believe it. I was like just dying. It was so cute and so funny, and it totally just like took the stress off of the situation because it was so ridiculous, and I was like just loving every minute of it. So I would really like to do a lot more of this kind of work, but obviously working outside can be a little finicky. The weather has to be good. You have to find a nice spot. The sun has to be right. It's much easier to work from a photo, but I think it is so helpful to be able to see the actual colors and the actual values of things outdoors. For another teacher, we had to do 50 skull drawings. So this was for an anatomy focused class. And if you guys have been around for several years, you may know that a couple years ago, I just had a really rough time drawing skulls for a couple weeks.
The update is that it's just not really working.
And I have to say, this time it has been skull redemption. I feel like I got a lot out of it. I really focused more on the planes and how the face looked at different angles, sort of how the jaw rotates and how the mouth barrel protrudes and the different planes above the eye sockets and whatnot. So This time around, I feel like this was very helpful. And obviously, this is not the last time I study skulls. Unfortunately, I feel like you just have to study skulls forever. But I think that doing this has been really helpful for me in terms of being able to use this later on to draw faces from imagination. This was a quick exercise where we had to study some kind of cultural use of skulls and then do some little sketches for it. This is a really, really terrible storyboard, objectively really terrible. I am struggling so much with storyboarding because I don't watch very many movies, almost never, and also I don't have a natural understanding of perspective. So doing a storyboard is really difficult for me. As you can see, I had a bunch of things on the side that kind of I need to put in the middle, and this is so hard for me, but it's actually a really helpful thing to do because I think any type of narrative illustration is something that I find really exciting and the type of work that I would like to do, even if it does end up looking super confusing like this. And last but not least, this was my first attempt to do life drawing on my iPad, and I have to say it was a little difficult at the beginning, but I started definitely getting the hang of it as I did more drawings. And it was really fun. I was surprised at how much I enjoyed working on the iPad. You can kind of put down a lot of color really quickly, and it obviously is much more forgiving because you can just erase anything so easily. But I do miss working on like a gigantic pad of paper. That's one thing I miss so much about being in a sort of a traditional art setting, is that you can draw on this gigantic pad of paper and have a lot of space. Most of this is happening in like little bars and coffee shops, so you don't quite get that full body experience, but it is still very useful. All right, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you soon.